AITA for revealing my dad's debt, after he said the $39,000 should go to my brother? I'm Bella, 42, and for years my extended family treated me like I was one bad month away from asking someone for rent money. The strange part was that almost nobody ever asked me directly if I was actually struggling. They just made comments that suggested they already knew. Things more stable now? You finally getting back on your feet? Your dad worries about you, you know? I learned to smile, say something vague, and change the subject. It was easier than explaining 9 years of family history at Thanksgiving or a birthday dinner. At least I told myself it was easier. The engagement dinner was where that stopped working. Kevin, my younger brother, is 37. He had recently gotten engaged to Sophie, who is 35. They had a small family dinner to celebrate, nothing elaborate. Maybe 15 people. My parents were there, my Aunt Marlene was there, Aaron was there with me, and a few other relatives who had known Kevin and me our whole lives. Aaron is my husband. He's 43 and we've been married for 13 years. At one point after dinner, my dad, Victor, stood up with his glass. He's 69 now. He likes speeches. He especially likes speeches where he gets to sound like the calm patriarch who has seen every kind of family problem and knows how people should handle them. He started normally enough. He said how happy he was for Kevin and Sophie. He talked about marriage, compromise, showing up for each other, all the usual things. Then he said, everybody at this table has needed carrying at some point. I felt Aaron look at me. Dad kept going. He said there had been times when Kevin needed help and times when I needed help, and that family wasn't about keeping score. He said parents gave when their kids were struggling, and later when circumstances changed, the kids should do the same for each other. Then he looked directly at me. Bella knows that better than anyone, he said. We helped her through some very unstable years. Now she's doing well, and Kevin is trying to start a home. So I think letting that old family note go, and putting that money toward Kevin and Sophie's house, is exactly what family is supposed to look like. For about 2 seconds I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. Not because I didn't know what he meant, because I couldn't believe he was doing it there. The old family note was a signed repayment agreement stating that my parents had borrowed $48,000 from me. They had repaid $9,000. They still owed me $39,000. And Dad was standing at my brother's engagement dinner telling relatives who had spent years believing I lived off my parents that I should forgive the debt, because my parents had supposedly supported me. A few people nodded. That was the part that got me. Marlene actually gave me a little smile, like this was some generous family moment she was watching unfold. I could have stayed seated. I could have asked Dad to step outside. I could have waited until the dinner was over. I knew all of that while I was pushing my chair back. Aaron didn't stop me. He just lowered his eyes to the table. I stood up and said, Dad, since you brought up the note, can you tell everyone whose name is listed as the borrower? His face changed immediately. Not dramatically. He just stopped smiling. He said, Bella, this isn't necessary. I said, you made it necessary when you brought it up. Kevin looked between us. What are you talking about? I had a photocopy of the note in my purse because of a separate argument Dad and I had been having about the house sale. I took it out, unfolded it, and put it on the table in front of him. I didn't read the whole thing aloud. I pointed to the bottom. Read the signature. Dad said, don't turn this into some kind of legal proceeding. It's not a legal proceeding. I'm asking you to read your own name. Marlene leaned forward. Kevin said, Dad. Finally Dad said, yes, I signed it. I said, because you and Mom borrowed $48,000 from me. You paid back $9,000. The balance is $39,000. That's the money you just volunteered for Kevin's house. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Marlene said, wait, you owed her. Kevin's face went red. He turned to Dad and said, you told me she agreed. Sophie looked genuinely confused. Can we not do this tonight? She said. That sentence landed harder than anything Dad said. Because she was right. She had not lied about me for 9 years. She had not promised away my money. And now her engagement dinner had become a family debt hearing. I wish I could say I sat down immediately after correcting the record. I didn't. Dad said, this is exactly what I mean. Family doesn't keep score like this. And I said, You signed the score. That was the point where Aaron closed his eyes for a second. I sat down after that, but the dinner never recovered. To explain why I got that angry, I have to go back 9 years. I was 33. Kevin was 28. Dad called me one evening and said he and Mom had hit a temporary cash problem. My parents weren't destitute. They owned their home, but they had debt against it, regular expenses, and some financial decisions I didn't fully understand at the time. Dad said several things had hit at once and they needed help bridging a few months. He was vague. That should have bothered me more than it did. Dad and I used to be very close, especially when I was younger. He was the one who taught me to compare prices, check fees, look at statements, and never sign something I hadn't read. If I got a weird charge on a bill, he was the person who would sit at the kitchen table with a pen and say, "Start at the top. Numbers tell you what happened if you actually look at them." So when he called and said he needed help, my first response wasn't suspicion. It was, "How much?" He asked for $8,000. I transferred it 2 days later. He told me, "I'll get this back to you as soon as we straighten things out." I said there was no rush. That first transfer was supposed to be the whole emergency. It wasn't. A month later, Mom called about property taxes. Then Dad needed money for an insurance bill. Then there was a payment related to their home equity line. Then another mortgage issue. The amounts varied. A few thousand here, a little more there. Some transfers were small enough that I could convince myself the end was close. Over 14 months, it added up to $48,000. I still remember opening my banking history and adding the transfers twice because I thought I had made a mistake. I hadn't. Aaron had never objected to helping my parents, but once the amount passed what either of us considered casual family help, he asked me a question that ended up mattering more than either of us knew. "Is this a gift or a loan?" I said, "A loan." He said, "Then call it a loan." I knew what he meant. Families get weird when money is left vague. One person remembers a gift. Another remembers a promise. Years later, everybody is angry about a conversation nobody documented. So we made a very simple repayment note. Nothing fancy. It listed the principal as $48,000. No interest. My parents could repay in installments. Any unpaid balance would become due when they sold the house or at the 10-year mark, whichever came first. Dad hated the idea. He looked at the paper and said, "You really need paper for your own father?" I almost backed down right there. Aaron said calmly, "Paper doesn't make it less family. It makes the promise clear." Dad stared at him for a second. Then he signed. Mom signed too. I signed. Aaron scanned it and kept a digital copy. That should have been the boring end of it. Instead, a few weeks later, Mom called me and asked me not to tell anyone in the family about the loan. "Your dad is embarrassed," she said. I asked why anyone had to know. She said, "They don't. That's the point. Please don't tell your aunts or your cousins or Kevin. He already feels like he failed." I didn't love the secrecy, but I understood the embarrassment. Dad had always thought of himself as the person who rescued other people. Needing his daughter to rescue him hit something deep in him. So I agreed. I thought I was keeping a private financial matter private. The first sign that it had turned into something else came a few months later. At a family gathering, a cousin I didn't see often asked me, "So did you find something steady again?" I remember laughing because I thought she had confused me with someone else. "Steady what?" She looked embarrassed and said, "Work." I said, "I'm fine." She changed the subject so fast that I knew somebody had told her something. I didn't make much of it. Then Marlene sent me a job posting. No context. Just a link and a message that said, "Thought of you. Your dad worries." I called her. "Why does Dad worry about my job?" She hesitated. Then she said, "He just said you've had a rough stretch." That same week I asked Dad directly what he had been telling people. He got defensive immediately. "I didn't tell anyone your business." "Apparently you told them something." "I just said you had a rough year." "I didn't have a rough year." He shrugged. Not literally. We were on the phone. But I could hear it in his voice. "Everybody has rough years." I said, "Why would you say that at all?" Then came the first version of what would eventually become his standard answer. I was trying to keep everyone from knowing how bad things got for him. But he said it in a way that made the two things sound connected. Like my imaginary instability explained why he couldn't discuss his real financial problem. I called Mom. I told her I was going to correct it. She panicked. Please don't. Please, Bella. He's telling people I'm struggling. He's humiliated that we needed you. That doesn't explain why I have to look broke. I thought it would blow over. I said, Marlene thinks I need a job. Mom went quiet. Then she said, let him have his pride. You know the truth. That sentence worked on me for longer than I want to admit. You know the truth. I did. Aaron knew. My parents knew. I told myself I was too old to care what extended family thought. So I let it go. The problem was that Dad didn't let it go. The story expanded. At first, I had supposedly had a rough year. Then I had needed help for a while. Then my parents had apparently carried me through my early 30s. I never got one clean confession from Dad where he said, yes, I told everyone I supported you financially. Came out in pieces. An aunt once told me, you should remember how much your parents did when you were having trouble. A cousin asked if I wanted an introduction to someone hiring. Marlene gave me budgeting advice at a birthday dinner after watching me pay for my own meal. One relative told Dad right in front of me, you never gave up on either of your kids. Dad smiled and said, that's what parents do. I stared at him. He didn't look at me. Aaron started pushing me to correct it. Not publicly, not with some giant announcement. He just wanted me to stop cooperating. You don't have to explain your bank account, he said once. But when somebody says your dad supported you for years, you can say, no, he didn't. I said. Then Mom calls me crying. Dad turns it into a fight. Everybody decides I'm obsessed with money. Aaron said. They already think you're bad with money. He wasn't wrong. But I still stayed quiet. My parents did repay some of the loan. Over the first few years, they sent back a total of $9,000. That mattered later because it made Dad's claim that the whole thing was just informal family help even less believable. They didn't send me one symbolic payment. They made multiple repayments. Then the payments slowed down and basically stopped. I asked Dad about it once. He said they were still tight and reminded me that the note didn't require regular monthly payments. Technically, he was right. The balance wasn't due in full until the house sold or the 10-year deadline arrived. I didn't need the money immediately. They were still living in the house. I didn't push. That was another choice that made sense at the time and caused problems later. Because Dad started acting as if my flexibility proved the debt wasn't real. If this mattered so much, he would say years later, you would have demanded it. But that wasn't what the agreement said. It said I was giving them time. As the family story about me grew, I started going to fewer gatherings. Not because I was secretly broke. Because I got tired of being treated like a cautionary tale. Dad noticed that too. According to Marlene, his new explanation was, Bella has always been difficult about family. So even withdrawing from the lie became evidence that something was wrong with me. 9 years after the first loan, Mom told me they were planning to sell the house. They wanted to downsize. That meant the repayment clause was finally going to come due. I pulled up the scan note. Original amount, $48,000. Repaid, $9,000. Remaining $39,000. I thought finally. Not finally I get money. Finally this whole stupid thing can be finished. Dad had a different idea. He asked to meet me without Aaron. That detail annoyed Aaron, but I went. Dad brought a one-page statement. He wanted me to sign saying the loan had been satisfied in full. I read it twice. Then I put it down. You've paid $9,000. Dad said, Bella. The note was $48,000. I know what the note says. Then why does this say satisfied? He rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. You really want to do this to your parents? I remember looking at him and thinking how strange that sentence was. Not, we can't pay. Not, can we negotiate? Not, we need more time. Just, you really want to do this to your parents? As if repayment itself was aggression. I said, I'm not doing anything to you. The house sale triggers the agreement. He said, "You're doing fine. That has nothing to do with whether you owe me money. Your brother needs a start." That was the first time Kevin entered the conversation. I asked, "What does Kevin have to do with this?" Dad said Kevin and Sophie wanted to buy a house and were coming up short for the kind of down payment they wanted. He said he and Mom had planned to help. I said, "Okay." He said, "There won't be much room to do that if we hand you $39,000. The wording bothered me. Hand me. Like it was a gift. Like I hadn't handed them $48,000 9 years earlier. Still, I didn't go straight to war. I made what I thought was a generous compromise. If you pay me $32,000 at closing, I'll consider the remaining $7,000 settled." Dad looked surprised. I continued, "But Kevin stays out of it. You don't tell him I gave away $7,000 for his benefit. You don't tell relatives this is me paying the family back for anything. We close the note privately and we're done." Dad said, "32,000 is still too much." I said, "Then the agreement says $39,000. He leaned back and looked at me. "You don't need it. Your brother does." I said, "That's not how debt works." He left angry. A few days later, I was with Kevin and Sophie for something unrelated to the engagement dinner. We were talking about normal things. At one point Sophie said, "And Bella, thank you, by the way, for being flexible about the house money." I looked at her. "What house money?" Her expression changed. "The money from your parents' sale." Kevin stopped what he was doing. Sophie said more cautiously, "Victor said you were okay with them putting the old loan money toward our down payment." I felt my stomach drop. "How much did he say?" Sophie said, "Around $39,000. Maybe $45,000 before everything's final." We weren't sure. I looked at Kevin. He said, "Dad said you already agreed to let the old note go." I said, "I absolutely did not." Kevin stared at me like he thought I was changing history in real time. He said you were fine with it. I offered Dad a private settlement at $32,000. He refused. Kevin said, "That's not what he told me." I know. The conversation got awkward fast. Sophie said they hadn't signed anything based on the money, but they had started planning around it. They were looking at houses assuming that some help would be available. I told them I was sorry Dad had put them in that position, but I had never agreed. Kevin didn't yell. In some ways that made it worse. He just got cold. "So now what?" he asked. "Now Dad pays what he owes unless he wants to accept the settlement I offered." Kevin said, "You know we've been planning around this." I didn't make that promise. "But you can still decide whether we get screwed by it." That sentence stayed with me, because I understood why he felt that way. From his perspective, Dad had offered help. Dad had told him I agreed. Now I was the visible obstacle. That was the power of the lie. By the time I corrected it, I looked like the person taking something away. I called Dad immediately after. "You told Kevin I agreed." He said, "I assumed you'd do the right thing. You assumed my answer because you didn't want to hear it. He's your brother. You don't get to promise somebody money you still owe me. You're making this uglier than it is." "No. You already told him the money was his. He needs it more than you do." I said, "Then give him your money." Dad hung up on me. A few days after that came the engagement dinner. So when Dad stood up and told the room I should forgive the debt because my parents had once supported me, it wasn't just another old lie. It was leverage. He was using the family's belief in that lie to pressure me into giving up $39,000. That's why I stood up. It also doesn't excuse everything about how I did it. On the drive home, Aaron was quiet for several minutes. Finally I said, "Go ahead." He said, "You know I think you should get every dollar you're owed." "I know." "You know I think your dad lied." "I know." He kept his eyes on the road. Then he said, "You corrected him. You also chose the one room where Kevin and Sophie couldn't leave without ruining their own night." I said, "He chose the room first." "He did." "Then what was I supposed to do? Sit there while he told everyone I owe him?" "I didn't say sit there." "What are you saying?" Aaron paused. I'm saying you can be right and still pick the cruelest room. I was angry with him for saying it, mostly because I knew exactly what he meant. I hadn't planned the dinner confrontation, but once Dad made the speech, a part of me wanted him to feel what I had felt for years. I wanted the same people who had looked at me with pity to look at him and realize he was the one who had needed help. That wasn't only self-defense. There was revenge in it. The next day Mom asked if she could come over. She arrived looking tired. Her first concern was Sophie. You need to apologize to her. I didn't argue. I will. Mom looked surprised. I said, Sophie didn't do anything to me. She didn't deserve that. Mom sat down. Then she said, and your father? No, Bella. I'm not apologizing for correcting what he said. You embarrassed him. He embarrassed himself. He was trying to make a point about family. He told a room full of people I should forgive a debt because he supported me. That is the exact lie he has used for 9 years. Mom said, he did support you. We both did. You're our daughter. Raising me is not repayment on a loan I gave you at 33. I'm not saying that. It's exactly what he's saying. Mom looked away. I asked her something I had asked before. Did you know how much he was telling people? She said, I knew there were comments. That's not what I asked. She started using the same phrases she always used. He was ashamed. He didn't mean for it to become a whole thing. I thought people understood he was speaking loosely. I let her talk. Then I said, I have an email from you. She looked at me. I had found it while searching old records after the dinner. It was from years earlier, after I first realized relatives thought I was unemployed. Mom had written, Please let your dad have this. He is humiliated that we needed you. I had never thought of that email as evidence before. Now it looked different. It didn't prove what Dad had told every relative, but it proved Mom knew exactly why I was being asked to stay silent. She said, I remember. I asked, then why did you act like I was imagining what people believed? She didn't answer. The larger truth came out because of Kevin. A few days later he called me. He sounded less angry than he had before. He said, I want to understand what happened 9 years ago. So we met. No parents. No extended family. Just the two of us. I showed him the scanned note on my phone. Then I pulled up the transfers. I had downloaded the relevant banking history after Dad asked me to sign the release. The transfers were spread across 14 months. Some had memos. Mortgage. Tax. HELOC. Insurance. Kevin looked at the dates. You really sent all of this? Yes. He looked at the repayments too. And they paid 9 back? Yes. He sat back. I didn't know. I know. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, Dad saved me once too. I'm not pretending he didn't. I looked at him. What do you mean? When I was 28. I remembered him joking about that years earlier. Dad saved my ass once. I'd assumed it was a few $1,000s. Kevin looked embarrassed. I had debt I couldn't keep up with. Bad decisions. Some credit stuff. A personal loan. I was behind. Dad paid it. How much? About $21,700. I actually thought I heard him wrong. $21,700? About that. When? He gave me the month. It was almost exactly when my parents' temporary cash problems started getting worse. I looked down at the banking history on my phone. One of my transfers a few months later had HELOC in the memo because Mom had told me that was what it was for. I asked Kevin, where did Dad say the money came from? He didn't. I assumed they had savings or borrowed it. You knew they paid it? Yes. You knew they struggled afterward? No, not really. He looked sick. I mean, I knew they complained about money, but Dad always complains about money. I asked him if he knew why they had a home equity line. He shook his head. That night I called Mom. I asked one question. Did any of the money I sent you replace money Dad used for Kevin? She didn't answer. I waited. Finally she said, "It wasn't that simple." "Then explain it." "Some of the home equity money went to household costs." "That wasn't my question." Another pause. Then she said, "Some of it went to Kevin." "How much?" "Bella." "How much?" "About $21,700. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the wall. I didn't yell. I didn't even feel angry at first. I felt stupid. Not because I had helped them. I would probably have helped even if I had known the whole truth. But I had spent 9 years protecting Dad's pride without knowing what I was actually protecting. He had rescued Kevin with money tied to the house. Then when the financial pressure caught up with my parents, I helped them. And instead of letting the family know his daughter had helped him after he helped his son, Dad created a version where he had financially carried both of us. Kevin got to remain the kid who had been helped once and moved on. I became the kid who supposedly never got stable. I asked Mom, "Did Kevin know?" "No." "Did you know Dad was telling people I was between jobs?" She went quiet again. That silence told me more than her answer did. "Mom." I may have said something like that once. Once. I don't remember exactly. "Did you tell people I was between jobs?" She started crying. That used to end conversations with me. Didn't this time. I waited. Finally she said, "Marlene asked why we were suddenly so careful with money. Your father had already told her you were having a hard year. I said you were between things and getting back on your feet." I said, "I wasn't." "I know." "Did you tell anyone else? Maybe one other person?" "I don't remember." "You helped it stick." "I thought it would fade." "It lasted 9 years." "I was trying to keep one bad year from defining us." I said, "So you let it define me." She cried harder. I felt horrible. I also didn't take it back. That was the second betrayal. For years I had thought Mom was weak in the conflict but basically innocent. I thought she had stood between Dad and me because she hated confrontation. That was only partly true. She had participated. Not as aggressively as Dad, but enough to matter. Dad reacted to the engagement dinner by doing what he had always done. He got ahead of the story. Within a few days, relatives started calling. His new version was that I had become obsessed with an old family loan, humiliated my parents publicly, ruined my brother's engagement dinner, and was now trying to take money from elderly parents who were selling their home. The fact that he and Mom were selling because they wanted to downsize disappeared. The fact that the note specifically required repayment at sale disappeared. The fact that I had offered to forgive $7,000 disappeared. The fact that he had promised my repayment to Kevin before I agreed definitely disappeared. Some relatives believed him. One told me, "At some point you have to stop treating family like a business." I said, "At some point he has to stop treating my money like his." Another said, "He's still your father." I said, "Yes." That seemed to annoy people because they wanted me to either deny that or act like it settled everything. Marlene called me differently. She said, "Send me the note." That was it. No speech. I sent her the scanned copy. About 10 minutes later she called back. "Your father told me the money ran the other direction." "I know. I told you to be grateful to him." "I remember." She sighed. "I owe you an apology for some things I said." "Thank you." Then she added, "I still think that dinner was the wrong place." I said, "So does Aaron." "Well, Aaron is right about that." I almost laughed. It was the first conversation in years with Marlene where I didn't feel like she was speaking to me, as if I needed supervision. By then Dad still had my offer on the table to settle the $39,000 balance for $32,000. I withdrew it. I sent him a short message. "The $32,000 settlement offer is no longer available. I will accept the full remaining principal of $39,000 at closing under the signed note. I am not requesting interest or additional penalties." He called immediately. "This is revenge." I said, "Maybe I was willing to be generous before you made generosity sound like something you were entitled to. You're punishing your brother." I'm not asking Kevin to repay your debt. I'm asking you not to give him my repayment. You have no idea what you're doing to this family. I said, I should have corrected you years ago. That part is on me. He was quiet for half a second. Then he said, You think that makes this better? No. I think it explains why I'm not staying quiet now. He hung up again. Kevin was furious when he learned I had withdrawn the discount. First, he told me, so Dad behaves badly and now Sophie and I are $7,000 farther from buying a house? I said, you were never entitled to the $32,000 either. I know that logically. Then what are we arguing about? He rubbed his face. That I already had the money in my head. That was the most honest thing he said during that whole period. I understood it. Dad had made a promise. Kevin had started imagining a house with that promise included. Losing imaginary money can still feel like losing something real. But that didn't make it mine to replace. Sophie was much clearer. She told Kevin in front of me, we'll figure out the house. I'm not building it on somebody else's unpaid loan. Kevin didn't argue with her. A couple of weeks before my parents' house sale was supposed to close, Kevin asked everyone involved to meet. He wanted no more separate versions. So it was me, Aaron, Dad, Mom, Kevin, Sophie, and Marlene. Dad came in with another copy of the release he wanted me to sign. I came with my phone and the scan note. Mom had some house paperwork because she had been sorting old statements and tax records for the sale. There was no magical folder containing every truth. There were fragments. That was enough. Kevin started the meeting. I want to know what happened with the old money, and I want to know what was actually promised now. Dad said, we've already been over this. Kevin said, no, you've talked over everybody. That was new. Dad stared at him. Kevin continued, when I was 28, did you pay $21,700 of my debt? Dad said, approximately. Where did that money come from? Dad said, our finances. Kevin said, that's not an answer. Dad's voice got sharper. It came from accounts available to us. Mom said quietly, part of it came from the home equity line. Dad looked at her. Monica. She didn't look back at him. Kevin said, and then you and Mom were short? Dad said, we had several expenses. I said, I'm not claiming every dollar I sent directly paid Kevin's debt. Dad snapped, good because it didn't. I'm saying you used borrowed money against the house to rescue him. Then within that same period you needed $48,000 from me to keep everything moving. Dad said, that's an oversimplification. Mom opened a stack of papers. I found 2 of the old statements. Dad turned toward her. For what? The equity line. He looked angry before she even showed them. Mom slid the statements onto the table. They didn't tell the entire story. They didn't have Kevin's name printed across them in giant letters. But they showed large transfers from the home equity line during the period Kevin said Dad paid his debt. Kevin recognized the amounts and dates well enough to confirm what one of them related to. That one, he said. That was part of it. Dad said, this is ridiculous. The fact that we helped Kevin has nothing to do with Bella's loan. Marlene spoke for the first time. Then why did you tell me Bella was the one you were carrying? Dad looked at her. She continued. You told me for years that Bella had trouble staying stable. You said you helped her financially. You made it sound like she was draining you. I never said draining. You said you were supporting her. I said we had helped her. Marlene said, you told me the money ran the other direction. Dad's face went red. He looked at me. This is what you wanted, right? Everyone sitting around judging me. I said no. What I wanted was for you to pay the note without promising the money to Kevin. He laughed once bitterly. Same thing. No. Yes, Bella. It is. Everything with you becomes proof. Statements. Notes. Exact amounts. You think family is a spreadsheet. I said, you're the one who used a fake spreadsheet for 9 years. Aaron touched my arm. Not to stop me, just enough to make me slow down. Kevin asked Dad, did Bella ever tell you I could have the 39? Dad looked at him. She knew you needed it. Kevin said. That's not what I asked. Dad said nothing. Kevin asked again. Did Bella ever agree that I could have the $39,000? Dad said. She offered to settle for $32,000. I said. With you. Kevin said. Dad. Finally Dad said. No. She didn't specifically agree that you could have it. Kevin leaned back. Sophie exhaled. Then Kevin asked another question. Why did you tell me she did? Dad looked genuinely offended by the question. Because I thought she would do what was right for her brother. Kevin said. So you told me yes because you thought she should say yes. Dad said. You needed the help. I could see Kevin struggling with something. For most of his life, Dad stepping in had been framed as proof of love. Dad solved problems. Dad found money. Dad helped. Now he was realizing that at least twice Dad's version of helping involved promising resources that were either borrowed or owed somewhere else. Kevin said. If the $39,000 is repayment, I don't want it called my gift. Dad said. Don't be dramatic. I'm not. You're letting your sister make you feel guilty for something that happened 9 years ago. I didn't know what happened 9 years ago. That's my point. Kevin looked at him. No. That's mine. The room got quiet. Then Marlene asked the question nobody had gotten Dad to answer directly. Why did you tell us Bella was living off you? Dad immediately said. I did not say living off me. Marlene said. Victor. He looked around the table. Mom was crying but she wasn't rescuing him. Kevin looked angry. Sophie looked exhausted. Aaron said nothing. I waited. Dad stared at the paperwork for a long time. Then he said, because I had just bailed out my son, and then I needed my daughter to bail me out. Do you know what that looked like? There it was. Not an apology. Not even really an admission that the lie was wrong. Just the reason. I said, it looked like what happened. He looked at me like that was the cruelest possible answer. Maybe it was. He said, I was trying to keep everyone from knowing how bad things got. I said, so you made them think it was bad for me. I never expected this to last 9 years. Mom said quietly, I did help it last. Dad turned to her. She wiped her face. I told Marlene Bella was between jobs. I told someone else she was getting back on her feet. Dad said, why are you doing this? Mom said, because it's true. He leaned back. I had never seen my mother refuse to soften something for him that clearly. It didn't repair anything between her and me, but it changed the meeting. Dad could no longer turn to her and say everybody remembered things wrong. Kevin said, I'm not taking money that is owed to Bella. Dad said, you and Sophie need it. Sophie said, we need a house we can afford. Those aren't the same thing. That was basically the end of the argument about the current money. Dad still wanted me to sign the release. I said I would sign only after the $39,000 was paid. No interest. No penalty. No demand for more. Just the remaining principal we had all signed for 9 years earlier. Dad called that cold. I called it the agreement. The house sale closed a few weeks later. My parents had enough proceeds to pay me and still move into a smaller place. I did not force them out of their home. I did not take every dollar they had. They had chosen to sell before this fight because they wanted to reduce expenses. The $39,000 hit my account 2 business days after closing. I stared at the deposit longer than I expected to. Not because it changed my life. It didn't. It was my money returning after 9 years. That felt different from receiving money. Kevin and Sophie did not buy the house they had originally been considering. They waited. A few months later, they chose something less expensive. Kevin hated that adjustment at first. Then, to his credit, he stopped talking about it like something had been stolen from him. He told me once, I got too comfortable with money I hadn't seen yet. I said, Dad made it sound done. I know. I still should have asked more questions. That was about as close as we got to resolving our part. We talk now. Carefully. We aren't especially close yet. There's too much old family structure underneath everything. He was the kid Dad protected from consequences. I was the kid everyone assumed could absorb them. Neither of us invented that system, but we both lived inside it long enough that it shaped what we expected from each other. I also apologized to Sophie. Not by saying I was sorry the truth came out. I wasn't. I told her, I should have stopped him without making your night the battlefield. She said, I believe you about the money. Then she added, I also wish I hadn't learned any of this at my engagement dinner. I said, I know. She accepted the apology. That did not mean everything instantly became normal between us. For a while she was polite but distant. I couldn't really blame her. Aaron was satisfied I apologized. He never asked me to forgive the debt, and he never asked me to make peace with Dad. He just refused to let me hide behind being factually right. That annoyed me at times. It also kept me from turning the whole thing into a story where every decision I made was automatically justified because Dad had lied first. Mom and I still speak. But things are different. I don't tell her financial details anymore. I don't ask her to carry messages to Dad. If she says, your father feels, I usually stop her and say, he can tell me. She doesn't like that boundary. She follows it more often now. Dad and I barely spoke for months after the sale. When we did, he was stiff. He never gave me the apology I wanted. He would say things like, I'm sorry this got out of hand, which is not the same thing as being sorry he lied. He still believes on some level that raising me gave him a moral credit balance large enough to erase whatever he owed later. I don't think I'm going to talk him out of that. Marlene changed faster than I expected. Not completely. She still thinks I handled the engagement dinner badly. So do I now. But she stopped repeating Dad's version. One day she called and said, I still can't believe we thought your dad was supporting you. I almost launched into the whole timeline again. Then I stopped. I didn't need to. I said Dad needed help. I gave it. That's the version I should have said 9 years ago. She said, yeah. And that was enough. A few days after the repayment cleared, I pulled out the paper copy of the note I had brought to the engagement dinner. Aaron had kept the original scan all those years. The paper in my hand was just a photocopy, folded twice from being shoved in my purse. I wrote paid next to the balance and dated it. I kept the electronic copy with the rest of our records. Then I tore the photocopy in half. Aaron was standing in the kitchen. Feel better? He asked. I thought about it. Quieter. That was the closest thing I got to a victory moment. I didn't post the bank records online. I didn't send a mass message to every relative. I didn't make Dad publicly apologize. Some people still think I was petty. Some think I should have forgiven the money because my parents are older. A few apologized for things they had said to me over the years. Others never did. The biggest change is that I no longer let Mom tell me, you know the truth, as if knowing it privately makes a public lie harmless. For 9 years, I thought silence meant I wasn't participating in the drama. I was wrong. My silence had a function. It let Dad keep using his version. It let relatives treat me like someone he had carried. It let Kevin believe family money moved in one direction. And eventually it let Dad stand at an engagement dinner and try to convert a real debt into a moral obligation I supposedly owed him. I still wish I had corrected him years earlier. I also wish I had chosen a better way to correct him that night. Both things can be true. What I don't regret is making the final transaction accurate. Victor needed help. I gave it. He signed a promise to repay it. And when the house sold, he did. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.